The file on the cotton plantation in Orangeburg County, South Carolina, didn't list the name of a father. It never would. The space where that information should have been was left blank, which told its own story, the kind of story that was common in that part of the world in 1927 and almost never spoken about aloud. The woman who came from that blank space spent 40 years building one of the most dazzling careers in American entertainment. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in January 1968, she sat in the old family dining room of the White House, raised her hand, waited patiently to be called on, and said something that cost her nearly everything she had built. What she said wasn't a threat. It wasn't an obscenity. She didn't accuse anyone of a crime. She stood up at a luncheon about juvenile delinquency, and she told the wife of the President of the United States that the government was sending the country's young men to die in Vietnam, and that this was the real reason kids were getting into trouble on the streets. She finished speaking. She sat back down. Lady Bird Johnson began to cry. By the following morning, Eartha Kitt was effectively unemployable in the United States. She had been born Eartha Mae Keith in January 1927 in the small rural town of North, South Carolina in Orangeburg County, a place where cotton was still a way of life and where the social order of the post-Reconstruction South remained largely intact. Her mother, Annie Mae Keith, was a young woman of African and Cherokee descent who worked as a sharecropper. The circumstances of Eartha's conception were, by most accounts, the result of rape by a white man, possibly the son of the plantation owner, possibly a local doctor named Daniel Sturkey, depending on which version of a story that was never fully resolved you believe. The details would remain murky for Kitt's entire life, in part because they were the kind of details that no one in that time and place wrote down honestly. Her mother couldn't keep her. Annie Mae eventually took up with a man who refused to accept a light-skinned child of ambiguous parentage, and so Eartha was sent to live with a relative named Aunt Rosa. What followed were years of poverty severe enough that she later described eating weeds pulled from the forest floor, and whatever onion-like roots she could find in the ground. There was abuse in Aunt Rosa's household. There was a degree of isolation that went beyond the ordinary loneliness of childhood. Eartha was rejected by black relatives for being too light and unwelcome in white spaces for obvious reasons. She existed, as a child, in a kind of racial no man's land that the rigid American taxonomy of the 1930s South had no category for. Her mother died when Eartha was around 7 years old, under circumstances the child found inexplicable and terrifying. Years later, Kitt described witnessing what she believed was a voodoo ceremony connected to her mother's death, and the conviction that Annie Mae had been poisoned never entirely left her. It was not a grief she was allowed to express publicly, and it was not a loss that entitled her to any particular consideration from the adults around her. At around 8 or 9 years old, the exact timing varies by account, she was sent to live with a relative named Mamie Kitt in Harlem, New York. This was the hinge on which the rest of her life turned. She attended the Metropolitan Vocational High School, which later became the High School of Performing Arts, and somewhere in those years of classes and rehearsal rooms and the particular ferment of mid-century Harlem, the thing inside her that the South Carolina cotton fields hadn't killed began to find its shape. She auditioned for Katherine Dunham's dance company at 16 and got in. This was not a minor thing. Dunham's troupe was one of the most serious black performance institutions in the country, a company built on anthropological rigor, on the integration of African and Caribbean movement traditions into concert dance, on an insistence that black art deserved the same intellectual seriousness as any other form. Kitt toured with the company through the late 1940s, performing across the United States, Mexico, and eventually Europe. She was in the ensemble, then a featured performer, and then in Paris, she stepped off the ship and never quite went back to the same version of herself. Paris did something to her that America hadn't. She was, in the France of the late 1940s and early 1950s, not a category problem. She was exotic, which is its own form of othering, but it was othering that came with opportunity rather than exclusion. She left the Dunham Company and began performing in Parisian cabarets, taught herself French, and within months was drawing the kind of audiences that nightclub owners dream about. Orson Welles saw her perform, called her the most exciting woman in the world, and cast her as Helen of Troy in his production of Dr. Faustus. He was not a man given to understatement, but, in this case, the extravagance of the description was not without basis. She returned to the United States in 1952 as something the American entertainment industry had not entirely figured out how to handle. A black woman with a European reputation, a cultivated multilingual sensibility, a voice that did things no other voice quite did, and a stage presence that made audiences feel like they were in the room with something genuinely feral. She was cast in the Broadway revue New Faces of 1952, where she performed a song called Monotonous, a comic number in which she cataloged the tedium of having been desired by every famous man alive and stopped the show every night. The recordings came quickly after that. C'est si bon in 1950 had already made her known to American audiences through the radio, but it was Santa Baby in 1953 that turned her into something unavoidable. The song was a deliberate provocation, a woman purring her way through a wish list of diamonds and convertibles and a platinum mine, addressed to Santa Claus as though he were a wealthy lover. And it worked because Kitt sold it with absolute conviction, without a wink or a nod or any indication that she thought there was anything to apologize for. The sexuality in the record was not coy. It was not performance. It seemed to come from somewhere real, which was the source of both its commercial appeal and the discomfort it produced in people who preferred their black women performers less unnerving. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, she accumulated a career that spanned Broadway, film, television, and the international cabaret circuit. She appeared in Anna Lucasta and St. Louis Blues and Mrs. Patterson on Broadway, collected Tony Award nominations, performed at nightclubs and concert halls in Europe and Asia and across the United States. In 1967, she was cast as Catwoman in the third season of the television series Batman, taking over the role from Julie Newmar, and brought to it a particular quality of playful menace that is still, decades later, what many people think of when they hear her name. She was also spending time by the mid-1960s working with young people in the poorest neighborhoods of Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. through a nonprofit organization called Rebels with a Cause. This was not a publicity effort. She had grown up eating weeds from a South Carolina forest and sleeping in subway stations as a teenager in New York. The kids she was working with were not an abstraction to her. It was this work that got her invited to the White House. Lady Bird Johnson had established a series of luncheons she called Women Doers gatherings, events designed to bring prominent women together to discuss social issues and, not incidentally, to generate favorable coverage for the Johnson administration's domestic policy agenda. The luncheon scheduled for January 18, 1968 was focused on crime in the streets, which was becoming a significant political liability for the Democrats heading into an election year. The previous day, Lyndon Johnson had delivered a State of the Union address that had landed without enthusiasm, and the First Lady was determined that this luncheon would provide some positive momentum. Kitt was on the guest list because of her work with Rebels with a Cause. She had genuine credibility on the subject being discussed. She had, in the most literal sense, lived the experience that the other women at the table were analyzing from a distance. She sat through the presentations. She listened to the speakers, judges, volunteers from community organizations, politicians' wives, teachers, and she kept her hand raised. When Lady Bird Johnson finally called on her, Eartha Kitt stood up and said what she believed was true. She said that the youth of America were angry, She said that the problem of crime on the streets could not be separated from the fact that the country was sending its young men to fight and die in Vietnam. She argued that a teenage boy who knew men with criminal records weren't drafted had little reason to avoid breaking the law, that the war had inverted the normal incentive structures of American civic life. She said that boys were being snatched from their mothers. She said that they didn't want to go to school because school was the path to a draft notice. The woman sitting next to Lady Bird Johnson was Betty Hughes, wife of the governor of New Jersey, whose son was serving in Vietnam. Hughes rose immediately and said that anyone who blamed the war for drug use was, in her words, some kind of a kook. Lady Bird Johnson, by multiple accounts, began crying. She eventually composed herself enough to respond, saying that she was praying for peace, but that in the meantime, people should focus their energies on constructive aims. She later issued a formal statement describing Kitt's remarks as a shrill voice of anger and discord that had drowned out the constructive things the other speakers had said. The newspapers had it on the front page the next morning. The White House received thousands of letters, most of them supporting the First Lady. The television coverage was extensive and almost universally framed as a story about a celebrity's lack of manners at a formal occasion. Kitt told reporters that her remarks had been unplanned and that she believed she was speaking for millions of Americans. This was probably true. It was also, in terms of the immediate professional consequences, beside the point. What happened next was not announced. There was no blacklist formally published, no official decree. What happened was quieter and more effective than that. Booking agents stopped returning calls. Club owners, who had always been happy to have her, suddenly weren't available. When Kitt pressed one of them, he told her he was sorry, but that she had become a problem. She began to understand that government investigators had been making rounds, asking questions, and that the asking of the questions was itself the message, that any venue associated with her was now a venue that had drawn federal attention. It wasn't until 1975 that a New York Times article revealed what had actually been happening behind the scenes. After the luncheon, the CIA had compiled a report on Eartha Kitt. The report did not contain credible evidence of any illegal activity or genuine threat to national security. It contained gossip, personal information, characterizations of her temperament and private life, assembled from sources that were not named and could not be evaluated. The report had been shared with the Secret Service. Its purpose, insofar as any purpose could be inferred from its contents, was to establish that Eartha Kitt was the kind of person whose opinions about Vietnam could be safely dismissed. She described this period of her life as becoming persona non grata in her own country. The phrase was precise. She wasn't arrested. She wasn't formally charged with anything. She was simply made unwelcome, in the way that only a country's informal social and economic structures can make someone unwelcome, which is to say completely. She went to Europe. She worked in Scandinavia and Britain and Germany and across Asia. In Norway, in July 1970, she performed to audiences who were not particularly interested in what she had said at a Washington luncheon 2 years earlier. The European press covered her as a performer rather than as a cautionary tale. She continued recording. She continued touring. She did not stop working, because stopping working was not something she had ever had the luxury of considering. There is something specific about what it means for a woman who grew up eating roots and weeds from a South Carolina forest to be economically targeted by the federal government of the country she grew up in. The poverty of her childhood had not been an abstraction. She had experienced it in her body, the particular grinding physicality of not having enough food, of sleeping in subways as a teenager, of being unwanted in every room she tried to enter. The career she had built out of that starting point was not merely a professional achievement. It was proof that the original conditions were not destiny. To have that career systematically undermined by agencies of the government in response to a few minutes of honest speech at a luncheon about juvenile delinquency was an experience that Kitt described in later years without self-pity, but also without any attempt to soften what it had actually cost. She came back to the United States in 1974, performing at Carnegie Hall to a reception that made clear the country had not entirely forgotten who she was. In 1978, she received her second Tony Award nomination. The entertainment industry that had quietly closed its doors to her quietly opened them again because the war was over. The administration that had targeted her was long gone, and the intervening years had made it possible to remember that Eartha Kitt was, on the merits, one of the more remarkable performers the country had produced. In January 1978, 10 years almost to the day after the White House luncheon, she returned to Washington to perform. She described the experience in terms that suggested she had been paying attention to the symmetry of it. Jimmy Carter invited her to the White House that same year. She went. The same building where Lady Bird Johnson had cried and issued a statement about shrill voices of anger. She spent the remaining decades of her career doing what she had always done, which was everything. She played the villain Yzma in Disney's The Emperor's New Groove in 2000, bringing to the role the same absolute conviction she had brought to every role for 50 years. She voiced the character again in the 2005 sequel and in a television series, winning 3 Daytime Emmy Awards for the performance. She played Madame Zeroni in Holes in 2003. She continued recording and performing live into her 80s, and her concerts attracted audiences that included people who had seen her perform in the 1950s and people who knew her only from a Disney animated film. She was still performing and recording in the last years of her life. She was diagnosed with colon cancer in 2008 and died on December 25th of that year at her home in Weston, Connecticut. She was 81 years old. Her daughter, Kit Shapiro, has continued to manage her mother's legacy and has spoken publicly about the CIA surveillance files and what they represented. Not just about what was done to Eartha Kitt specifically, but about the mechanisms by which the United States government dealt with black women who said things in public that the government found inconvenient. There is a photograph taken by Kevin Smith on January 18, 1968, in the old family dining room of the White House. In it, Eartha Kitt is speaking and Lady Bird Johnson is listening. The photograph is in the collection of the Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library. It is a clear photograph, well lit, technically unremarkable. What it shows is a woman who grew up with no birth certificate, no father, no reliable food supply, and no reason to believe the world owed her anything, standing in the most powerful house in the country, saying what she thought was true, to the person in the room most likely to make her pay for it. She said she never regretted it. She also said that what she learned from it was that if you tell the truth in a country that says you're entitled to tell the truth, you get your face slapped and you get put out of work. Both of those things can be true at the same time, and in her case, they were.